Mr. DIY Solar Saga, a bright idea in the making. Mr. DIY, as everyone in the neighborhood fondly called him, was a man of many talents. Whether it was fixing a leaky faucet, building a treehouse, or revamping an old car, there wasn't a task too big or too small for him. He loved the challenge of solving problems, especially the ones that made life a little easier or more efficient. But there was one problem that had been gnawing at him for a while, one that even his trusty toolbox couldn't fix: his skyrocketing electricity bills. Every month, like clockwork, the utility bill would arrive in the mail. And every month, it seemed to creep a little higher, no matter how careful Mr. Di and his wife, Mrs. Green as the neighbors called her due to her passion for gardening, were about conserving energy. They'd switched to LED bulbs, and plugged appliances when not in use, and even invested in energy-efficient windows. But still, the bills kept climbing. One sweltering summer afternoon, as Mr. Di wiped the sweat from his brow while working on a new garden trellis for Mrs. Green, he had an epiphany. The sun was blazing down, relentless and unyielding, making the day unbearably hot. Yet, it was also a source of immense power that was currently going to waste. Why not harness that energy? He thought. The idea of solar panels had crossed his mind before, but he'd always pushed it aside. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. But now, the idea seemed to be calling out to him, daring him to take on a new challenge. That evening, after dinner, Mr. DIY sat down with his trusty old laptop and began researching solar panels. As he delved deeper, he found himself torn between excitement and skepticism. On one hand, the idea of generating his own electricity was incredibly appealing. On the other hand, the more he read, the more doubts crept in. The problems unveiled. The first issue that caught his eye was something he hadn't considered. Solar panels don't always produce as much power as advertised. Sure, the sun was always shining somewhere in the world, but that didn't mean every ray of sunlight would be captured and converted into electricity. The placement of the panels, the angle of the roof, and even minor manufacturing variations could all affect the output. Mr. Di frowned. His roof wasn't exactly a solar panel's dream. Some parts of it were shaded by the large oak tree in the front yard, and other sections didn't get as much sun because of the way the house was positioned. He also read about expected losses through wiring and the conversion process from DC to AC power. It all seemed a bit overwhelming, and for a moment, he wondered if this was a project even he couldn't handle. But Mr. DIY wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He reasoned that no system was perfect, and any energy he could produce would still be better than relying entirely on the grid. Plus, with careful planning, he could minimize the inefficiencies. It was just a matter of being smart about where and how the panels were installed. The aesthetic dilemma. Next issue was a bit of a sore spot for Mrs. Green. Aesthetics. Solar panels, while functional, weren't exactly known for their beauty. Some of the early models looked downright industrial, turning a charming home into something that resembled a power plant. Mr. Di could already hear Mrs. Green's voice in his head, lamenting how a row of clunky panels might ruin the look of her beloved cottage-style house. But as he continued his research, he was pleasantly surprised. Modern solar panels had come a long way since the clunky, silver-framed monstrosities of the past. The latest models were sleek, with black-on-black designs that blended in much better with residential roofs. In fact, some were so discreet that they barely stood out at all. Mr. DIY made a mental note to show Mrs. Green these new designs. He knew that if they could find panels that didn't clash with the house, she'd be more open to the idea. The cost conundrum there was the issue of cost. Solar wasn't cheap, and Mr. DIY had always prided himself on being financially savvy. He knew that taking on debt was generally not a good idea, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just any expense. This was an investment in their home and their future. He recalled the advice he'd once given his neighbor when he'd bought his first home: a mortgage isn't bad debt because it's something you use every day, and it has a final payment somewhere down the road. Solar, he realized, was much the same. It wasn't just about cutting the electric bill. It was about adding value to the house and gaining energy independence. He ran the numbers, calculating how much they spent on electricity each year. When he projected that over the next 20 or 30 years, factoring in the inevitable rate hikes from the utility company, the total was staggering. Solar, while expensive upfront, would pay for itself in savings. And after the system was paid off, they'd be generating power for free, with just the occasional maintenance cost. The resale myth. Another point that gave Mr. diyOhMG pause was the notion that solar might actually make it harder to sell their home in the future. He found conflicting information on this topic. Some sources claim that poorly installed or leased solar systems could indeed be a turn-off for buyers. But then he discovered that, with a reputable installation and proper documentation, solar could actually increase a home's value. The real estate market was catching up to the benefits of solar, and homes with energy-efficient upgrades were becoming more desirable. Mr. diyOhMG realized that, should they ever decide to move, having a solar-powered home could be a selling point rather than a drawback. Plus, with programs like Pearl certification, they could ensure that the system was properly appraised, so it wouldn't be undervalued. The final push. Despite all these concerns, one thing stood out to Mr. diyOhMG: the urgency of the moment. Advances in technology were inevitable, but waiting for the perfect system meant missing out on years of savings and environmental benefits. The current technology was stable, the incentives were good, and energy costs weren't going to get any lower. He knew that if he waited, he'd just be throwing money away on rising electricity bills. A bright outcome. After weeks of research and discussions with Mrs. Green, Mr. diyOhMG decided to go for it. He contacted a reputable solar installer, one that had excellent reviews and a track record of doing things right. They worked together to design a system that would be both efficient and aesthetically pleasing. The day the installation was complete, Mr. diyOhMG stood back and admired the sleek, black panels on his roof. They didn't just blend in, they looked good. But the real joy came when the first post-solar electric bill arrived. Mr. diyOhMG and Mrs. Green sat at the kitchen table, holding the envelope with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. When they opened it, the relief was palpable. The bill had been slashed by more than half. Over the next few months, as the savings continued to add up, Mr. diyOhMG found himself thinking less about the initial cost and more about the long-term benefits. He had done it. He had taken on a challenge, solved a problem, and made life a little better, not just for himself, but for the planet as well. Sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sunset, Mrs. Green turned to him with a smile. "You know," she said, "I wasn't sure about those panels at first, but now, I think they were the best thing we've ever done for this house." Mr. diyOhMG smiled back, content in the knowledge that, once again, he had dined his way to a better life.